And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 285. Today is a feedback session. So we've had 4 people send in images which we're going to take a look at, go through what they talked about, their sticking points, and kind of deconstruct, reconstruct, and see if we can solve the problems for them. Meanwhile, we happen to be here live. If you're watching live, that is, leave a comment. Let me know you're here. And let me know what the weather's like. We can make a start. Which one am I supposed to be doing now? This one. So yes, welcome to episode 285, a feedback session. So interesting stuff today, looking at portraits, looking at the notion of negative space, looking at how we can make smoke contrast with a background. Lots of fun, lots of really interesting stuff. So we're here live on YouTube. If you happen to be watching live, then leave a comment in the chat part. Let me know you're here. Let me know what the weather's like. Let me know where you're from, all the usual bits and pieces. And if you happen to be watching the recorded version, you can still leave comments as we go. It's just I won't be able to respond in real time. And of course, if you are leaving a comment on something, let me know what you're leaving a comment on. Occasionally I get little notes in the from people who are posting afterwards saying, love this photo. I have no idea which photo you're talking about. So things like that. Yeah, just a little bit of housekeeping. Meanwhile, if you happen to be watching live or maybe afterwards anyway, but click like. If you don't mind, the like is always useful. I think the more people who click like, the more likely the algorithms are to show it in people's feeds of potential photographers who are watching YouTube. Up in the side bit comes, ooh, live now. And occasionally we've gained new followers and people who interact because of that, I think. So yes, like is always a useful one. Meanwhile, I see we have a couple of people in already. So Lisa says, hello from a cloudy, warm Maryland. By contrast, Gunilla is saying hello from Orland, where it is rainy, wet and windy here today. Janet says, hi from a cool overcast Mississauga, 21C on Friday, a high of 6C today on it. A bit of a difference. Susan says, hi from a sunny but windy Kirkcudbright. Fortunately, Storm Dave, whoever names these storms, wasn't too bad hereabouts. Hope you're going to tell us about about the cover photo for today's podcast, Kim. The cover photo is one of those that will be mentioned today, yes. Yeah, I'll come back to that. Susan is just a little bit down the road from where I am. So yes, you're right. Storm Dave wasn't quite as bad as we were fearing. I think it just kind of, here at Castle Douglas, Kirkcudbright was just kind of on the edge of the worst of it. Meanwhile, here today, at the moment, blue skies and sunshine. We have had rain. I was out for a walk earlier and it was overcast and cold and windy. So there's a little bit of everything here. At the moment, you're probably seeing the light bouncing off. There's a white Range Rover just out there, which is probably causing the shadow behind me. But if it goes overcast, you'll notice the light changing around me. I'm just working from window light today. What else do we have? John says hello from mid-Ohio. Cloudy and rainy here. Ajdin has joined us and says greetings from Sarajevo. I did wonder, Ajdin, quite where you were from. That's interesting to know. Excellent. Marci says good morning, Kim and everyone. Viji says hi, friends, from a very hot and humid Chennai in southern India. And Sandra joins us from everybody from a sunny and windy Birmingham. That's Birmingham, UK. Excellent. Well, we have people. We have a topic. We have a subject. So let's have just a quick little introduction, first of all, to the notion of feedback. This is a feedback session and feedback critique, which is I think, one of the best ways of improving your photography. We can talk about all these different ideas of light, composition, narrative, camera settings, all this kind of stuff. But sometimes we can have all this information and we still don't really know how it applies to our own photos. It's much easier to see it with other photos than it is to see with our own. But getting direct feedback on our own images by far and away is one of the most powerful ways of improving your photography. And I know this from my own direct experience. I wasn't born with a camera in my hand. I only took up photography in any kind of seriousness once I was already into my 40s. And I started off doing what everybody does, photograph of peeling paintwork and rusty door handles and a lonely tree on the hill, that kind of thing. And then there was a particular site I joined and it had a feedback set, a critique area. And I used to put my images in for critique. And the amount that I learnt from that absolutely accelerated my photography. It made leaps and bounds in what I did. Now, the problem was there were certain people who were complete... can't think of a family-friendly word for it. But basically not particularly pleasant. They were on their own little power trips, and that they would be quite nasty about your photos if you'd got something wrong. Not everybody, but there were one or two people who were. And it used to make me angry. And sometimes I just couldn't go back on the site because I was just fuming for a week until I kind of calmed down. Very often they were quite accurate in their critique. It's just they were not very tactful about it. But I learned a huge amount from it. So when I set up these podcasts, which I will just say is next week will be 6 years since I began these podcasts exactly. When I set up these podcasts, the idea of giving critique and feedback was a really important part of what I wanted to do with this, but without being nasty about it. Constructive, to help you learn and elevate your photography. So it is a really important side of it and well worth doing. So today we have 4 people who've sent in: Gunilla, Ajdin, Marci and Viji have all sent in images. And I think you're going to find, we're going to learn a few things, and, I think you'll find it really interesting. Alan's joined us and says, hi from a windy Bridlington. Glad you get that's in Yorkshire, I think, yes. And Nadia says, hi everyone from Fife. Excellent. So just a quick little thing here, that if you are sending in images for critique or any of the challenges, then the email address to send them to is kimayrespodcast@gmail.com. I set it up specifically to receive images so that my own mailbox doesn't get too crowded up. Oh, Marilyn's joined us as well and says hello from a sunny Colorado. Viji says, congratulations on the 6 years. I can't remember whether it's this week or next week. I'm fairly certain it's next week. So although I don't have a podcast specifically dedicated to the 6th anniversary next week, I'll probably mention it again. Okay, so let's make a little start here. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to start off with Ajdin in Sarajevo. Now, interesting. There's a few things to talk about with this one. So what I will do is, actually, before I do anything else, let me just tidy up my desktop a little bit here so that I can make sense of how everything's laid out. And this way I can carry on reading the comments without blocking it with the pictures. So what we have here is Ajdin has sent in this photo. No, sorry. This photo, yes. Now, Ajdin says, this is a shot I have some unfinished business with. I will just say, actually, Ajdin did originally send this in for the headshot challenge that we had last week. But it turned out he was actually looking for critique. So I said, well, look, we could bump it forward into the critique section if you want. And he said, yes, that would be great. So this is why we're dealing with it this week. He says it's an older shot from a few years ago, taken specifically for a university assignment, to be exact. The topic was headshot photography. The reason why I said unfinished business is that unfortunately I never got the critique for the shot, as the professor was absent during the following weeks. What stings even more is that the grade I received was not a passing grade, so maybe this is the right time to find out why. The topic was a simple headshot, with the only narrative being that I shot my colleague who studied law, so it required something more serious and dramatic. I aimed at achieving that limited light, black outfit, serious expression. If I can recall correctly, it's just one softbox on the left, a black wall on the other side to get some of the negative fill with no unneeded light bounces. So what Ajdin has done here then is he's got a softbox up here coming down and lighting up the face, and then he's actually got a black. Sometimes I've talked about putting a white wall or piece of paper or a reflector or something to get a bit of bounce light. He's actually got a black bit here precisely to stop any bounce light coming back. That way it just keeps the light solely on one side. Actually tends to give it a very painterly feel. If you look at a lot of most paintings of portraits, certainly if you're looking at like the Dutch Old Masters or anything like that, they weren't working with lighting system. So they tended to use window light or candle light. And very often you just had a single light source. And so a single window source is and so a large softbox tends to emulate that. What it looks like Ajdin has also done here is given a very slight kind of yellow tint. It's moved into the yellows rather than the blues, giving it a slightly warmer colour, which again kind of hints at that notion of, like, I suppose, varnish, you know, like the kind of yellowish, aging varnish that you get it. So the whole effect is a very painterly kind of portrait. But he goes, where do we get to? Yes. So that's what he said about it. Now, a couple of comments here. Marilyn says, lovely portrait. Sandra says, nice portrait. Susan says, love it. Girl with the pearl earring springs to mind. And Ajdin says, yes, we did some painterly assignments before this, specifically Rembrandt lighting. Yeah. Okay. So what we have here is, so Ajdin has done the lighting setup. He's gone for a very specific look. And within that, you know, he's done the job that he needs to do. However, it didn't get the pass mark that he wanted. Why is that? Now, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to explore a couple of different aspects of where, now, obviously I'm not the professor who judged it. I'm not I won't know the absolute reasons for it. But there are a couple of things that I can think of where I feel that attention to certain bits of detail where it might have worked in your favour had you taken these things on board. So if you're ready for this, Ajdin, let's make a start. Now, the very first thing, and actually quite now. Yep, let's just go for it. The most important thing, actually. I'll go for the most important thing first. And that is focus, your focal point. And what I mean by that is if I zoom in here, what we find is the nose is really sharp. We can see the pores on the skin. The hair is really sharp. The eye is just fractionally out of focus. Now, I can't remember what setting did you have on that? Did you have a there was a, now I think somewhere along the line, well, you know, you're using an f5.6 45mm length. I think you might have been zoomed in. The point being is that the focal point has just missed it. Okay, so the person's turned here and the plane is tipping the nose and the hair, which is coming at the hair, and the focal point is not quite back on the eye. Now, I did wonder whether this was just because this is a slightly smaller cut version. Now, Ajdin also sent me the raw version, so I'll show you the raw version. This is the pre-edited. I'll just hit auto on that so it's brightened up a little bit. And we can see the amount of work that Ajdin has done with it, which is great. I'm not too worried about, you know, we're not going to try and re-edit Ajdin's photo. I think essentially the edit is fine. He's cleaned up the skin. He's given it the colour contrast that he wanted. But to go back, to just come in and double check here, and yes, we find here, if I come up at 100%, we can really see the pores on the nose. It's sharp. That's absolutely where the sharp point is. The tip of the hair here, absolutely sharp. The eye isn't. And when you're doing portraits, the one thing you absolutely have to have in focus is the eye that's closest to the camera. Now, there are occasionally exceptions to this. You know, if you've got an animal, you know, big jaws leaping towards you and your focus is on the teeth, that's fine because the focus is supposed to be on the teeth. But in a headshot, in a portrait like this, the absolute focal point, the point that the eye gets drawn to first and foremost with no exceptions, is the eye at the front. And your eye at the front is just not quite there. And I would say that in itself is probably the first thing. That's the key thing where it falls apart. And it's so easily done in the back of the camera. So even if you're using a modern camera which has auto eye focus, sometimes, and I've had this before, if I've got a very shallow depth of field, if I've got like using an f2.8 or less, then it can, and especially if you've got a woman with long eyelashes, it can focus on the tip of the eyelash and the eye itself can still be out of focus. So in the back of the camera, it might look fine. Even on a normal screen, it might look fine. And at this size, it looks fine. But at the point you zoom in, you realise the focus isn't on the eyeball. And that is where I think your first mistake really is. Now, having said that, there's now 2 or 3 other things which I think are also slightly working against you. One of them is the hair at the back. And, you know, given that you're talking about if this is supposed to be a law graduate, a student, it's a serious photo. This hair looks like it's just quickly been bunched up at the back, and it's kind of a bit messy. It's not like a smooth ponytail, and it's not kind of cut. It just kind of looks sort of slightly like a lump. And what it does is it creates a problem when you come to crop, because the natural crop for a portrait on something like that, we'll pull this down to there, is if we were doing a portrait, you would want it to, the face would be somewhere about there, give or take. But what happens is we then cut through the hair. So maybe we make this more of a square crop, something like that. But then in order to get her hair in, her face is now too far over to the left. If we moved her head on a square crop more central, which is kind of what we'd expect, her hair gets clipped. So that feels wrong. We kind of feel we want to have the space. So wherever we're putting it, the hair isn't quite, you've really got to go to something like a sort of much more landscape shot, something like that, I think, before you're going to, now, okay, let me just change that. Before we're actually going to get a kind of a balance with it. So I would say the hair is another aspect, and either you kind of, you know, more attention at the time you're doing the photo and she sorts her hair into a different thing, or maybe like you Photoshop the skin, you might need to Photoshop the hair to bring it back in. Now there's another bit here which did I notice somebody had said, yes, Lisa said I would have turned her head slightly more to the left. Okay, so bringing it round slightly more to the camera. And I think this is another key part of it, which is if we essentially what we've got is the white of her eye is right on the corner of her face, and that just feels slightly wrong. And her eyes are turned so far around because her head isn't turned very far. Her eyes are really turned, and what it's doing is it feels strained. It's not, it doesn't feel like a portrait. It feels like she's looking at you out the corner of her eye, and it's not quite there. So what I want you to, now I can't quite see my face here. So I'm going to have to, what I want you to do, if we consider the idea that that window there is not a dissimilar kind of angle from the light that you've got on the screen. So I want you to look from it. Now, okay, we've got a white background, not a dark background, but I want you to watch. I'm going to turn my head this way, and I'm going to try looking at the camera. Now, at the moment, I'm kind of probably in complete profile. As I come round, I now just get to the point whereby I can just about see the camera with this eye. Can't really see it with this eye. How comfortable does that look? Especially actually if I turn completely. I've got to come round a little bit further, a little bit further. It's still looking strained. Now, if I come round to about here, that's maybe better. Okay, we've got a little bit more here. I'm turned a bit more. It now looks like I'm focused on you. It doesn't look like I'm really straining around the corner. Okay. So that angle, I think her head needs to be turned a little bit more towards the camera. It just feels like she's really straining at it there. And then one final little thing, it's not an absolute, it's not the kind of thing that would have tipped the points particularly on passing or failing. I think these other things would have made more of a difference. But is, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Okay, no, it's okay. I'll carry on with this one. Is a slight tilt of the head will honestly make all the difference. And what I want to show you here is I will just cut out her head here, copy, paste, and I'm going to tilt it a fraction. Okay, just roughly line her neck back up like that. And can you see the difference? Can you see the difference between a head straight and a head tilted? And that a little bit of tilt just starts to make a difference, so that the eyes aren't absolutely, there's a slight diagonal in that. In fact, maybe we could, now the question is, how far could we tilt it? Maybe a touch more. Is that improved? Actually, possibly it is. Too far, and no, now it just looks wrong. Okay. Oh, thank you. People are telling me I can't see. Right, let's go back. Right. Sorry, to come back to here. What I've done here, you're right, sorry, I apologise about that. So to come back here, I'm going to copy and paste the head back on. And the point that I'm trying to make here is the tilt. Is that a slight tilt of the head, like this, actually, I think, improves the overall composition. Okay. Now again, head turned towards the camera a little bit more. Like I was saying, if you tilt it too far, it just feels wrong, you know, especially if you have it kind of tilted like this. Now it feels uncomfortable again. So you've got to kind of find a natural but a slight angle, I think, tends to make a little bit of a difference. So this is what I'm saying, is the difference then between the straight up, which is feeling very strained, and that slight tilt is also about the sense of engagement. One of the things we talked about with, I think I mentioned in the headshot challenge, I can't remember whether I mentioned it now or not, I should have, is the notion of when someone is looking at you in a picture, if they are leaning into you slightly, if their head is tilted slightly, it looks as though they are listening to you. It looks as though they are engaging with you. Whereas when their head's up and they're pulled back or they're straight up, it's more defensive. So if you are trying to create a portrait where you actually feel like the person is engaging with you rather than actually almost trying to protect themselves against you, then a slight tilt of the head helps. And a slight turn of the face, you know, a turn of the face, but you've got to be not too far turned round. So overall then, Ajdin, what we're talking about is there's 4 different aspects to this photo which I think have played against you. So there's the tilt of the head, which is which I've just told. There's the how far round the head comes. There's the hair at the back, which is throwing the balance out. And then primarily there's the bit with the front of the eye needing to be in focus. And I think if you combine all these together, that's probably why the fail came. The fail primarily about the focus of the eye. I think also the fact that she feels strained when she's pulled round. But if we go back to, I mean, your editing, nothing wrong with the editing. Your lighting, nothing wrong with the lighting. You've specifically gone for a very painterly look. But if you took your edited version, and again, she was turned slightly more, she had a very slight tilt in the head, and she had the front eye, closest to the camera, that bit was actually in sharp focus, then I think you may well have got the passing grade you wanted with that photo. So I hope that helps, Ajdin. Thank you very much for sending that one in. It was really interesting to sort of to work it out and to kind of deconstruct. You can look at a photo and you go, yeah, I like it, no, I don't like it, whatever it is. But to be able to really kind of take it apart and say, well, okay, what are the specifics here and what would improve it? Hope that makes sense. Okay, what have we got in terms of comments here? Ajdin says, whoa, never noticed this detail about the eye. Yeah, you know, it's such a common thing. And this is to come back to what I said about the importance of getting feedback, is we become, we don't see our own blind spots. We become so familiar with our own picture that we essentially filter out the things that we're not expecting to see. We only see what we're expecting to see. And so sometimes there can be something that's really obvious to somebody else that just isn't obvious to us. So, yeah. Meg joined us and said, hello, everyone. Yes, Ajdin said the session was a bit rushed, so I didn't totally think about the hair. And kind of, again, it's another one of these problems that you probably weren't because you're thinking about getting her in focus. And it's one of these things I've come across quite a few times when I'm doing portraits and what have you. I'm so focused on the idea of getting the camera settings right, the lighting right, and also even interacting with the person to make sure the expression is right. But I don't know a lot about hairdressing. I don't know a lot about makeup. And sometimes these things can get missed. And, you know, it becomes glaringly obvious as not quite right to somebody else, but it's not my area of expertise. Okay, then there's a couple of people saying they couldn't see the image, but now I've got it. Marci says she does look like she studies law. Ajdin says, honestly, your critique was great. I now understand many things. Reminds me of our professor style of critique. Oh, well, I'm glad that's useful. Sandra says I found the feedback the hair, the eyes, the head to tilt, very interesting. John says, really good pointers on the portrait headshot. And Marilyn says, great feedback on the portraits. Excellent. Great. Glad that was useful. Right. Okay. Next up then, we're going to go to Gunilla. Now, Gunilla said, my question is about negative space. I've watched your podcast on negative or dead space. I'm now trying to understand that when I take pictures. I took some photos yesterday and we had fog the whole day. So she sent 2 pictures, but I'm going to be primarily dealing with one of them. So this was one, and oh no, where are we? This is the other. Okay. And she says they're both subjects on the same wetland, but with different views. This picture, which is 512, is a wider view of the scene with the water platform reeds in the foreground, and in the back you can see the town in the distance covered in fog. Above this is just grey fog and nothing else. I think the subject, now what she was talking to, she was giving me a couple of Gunilla's mentioned that this one, what she can see here is that the notion of negative space. So, okay, what we're talking, quick little point about negative space. Negative space is the space that is not the subject, but is not drawing your attention. Okay, so in this case, the sky behind the trees is, you would call it negative space. It's just space behind the subject, if the tree is the subject. Now the reeds, you wouldn't call negative space because the reeds are textured. They are part of the picture that without, that it would change dramatically if you change the reeds. The reflections likewise are part of the picture. The reeds and the reflection are contributing to the tree. Now, the negative space is also contributing, but in a different way. It's not what our eye is drawn to. Essentially, our eye filters it out. So, where are we? So, Gunilla says, now, I think the sky is the negative space, and that helps display the subject, the tree and the reeds. Yes. You can't really say it's sky. It could have been a wall, and that's why I think it's negative space. It helps define the object. But the sky in the other photo, so, sorry, come back. No, not what I'm trying to do. Right, there we go. Sorry, getting preview of Marci's photo. We'll come on to that afterwards. So this, so back to this one. And she said, now, what Gunilla says here is the sky in this photo is just a sky. You can't imagine it as something else. That's why I don't think of it as negative space. The sky is an important part of the image and can't be reduced to negative space. But here come in my doubts. Is it negative space after all? Because it's a solid grey without variations, or clouds or other colours. I think the sky takes up too much space in the picture, but I can't figure out how to crop it so it will be more balanced. If you could help me with that, I'd be very thankful. Feel free to make other suggestions too. Okay, so what we have here then is, well, not worry too much about the other photo. Primarily what I'm going to talk about is this one here. Now, there's 2 things that Gunilla is concerned about. One is a kind of philosophical notion, which is, does the sky count as negative space? And it sounds like you're kind of struggling with that notion of what negative space is. The other is, would this work better if it was cropped in a different way? So let's just talk briefly about that notion of negative space. And negative space is essentially the space that isn't the it doesn't have, sky can absolutely be negative space. The wall behind me is negative space. You can have a photo of like a bird or a flower with the background blurred out and it's just a kind of rough green behind it, or a very blurry green, tiny bit of texture. That is still negative space. The negative space is the bit that's not the subject, but that space around it helps to define the subject. So just on a philosophical point, the use of the term negative space absolutely applies to the sky in this case, just as much as it applies to the sky in the other version of the photo. So that's the first bit. I hope that makes sense. So don't get too hung up on whether it literally counts as. Basically, if it's fairly plain and it's used, I mean, in this case, the blank sky, is allowing the trees to, stand out against it. Even little bits of like where bits are coming up in the town in the background. So yeah, the sky is negative space here. You could say in some ways the water of the reflections is a kind of a negative space as well. It's just that it's crowded up a bit more. So if you were doing a picture called, if you were entering a competition called negative space and you did something which was down here, it's less likely to be ranked so highly, I would say, but it is still, strictly speaking, negative space. Comments here, what have we got? Somebody's noticed April's not here today. That's true, April's missing, mind you, but it is also Easter Day. That's a quick point. Happy Easter, everyone. April, I seem to remember, is slightly more with some of the Christian religious observances, so it's quite possible she's doing something for Easter today. Now, what have we got here? Ajdin says, I think this photo here could work nicely with a crop. If you crop it from the top, you get a cinematic crop or a wide one. Viji is also talking about the reflections are sharp. And Marci's saying Happy Easter as well. Right, so what we're talking about here, now it's interesting. There's a couple of different ways we can go about the crop with this. And the first thing that both Viji and Ajdin mentioned is the kind of notion of cinematic. And that is, yes, you've got all this sky above here. Do we need that amount of sky? Now, interestingly, one of the things I'm going to do here actually is, you did send me the, where are we? Yes, the raw file. Now, actually, in the raw file, it's not completely white. In the raw file, there is a kind of watery sun up here, which I have to say I really quite like. So I'm going to open your picture. I'm going to open your raw file here. Now, if I click auto, just brighten it up a bit. But I'm going to allow that bit of thing in the sky. So this kind of stops it being as much negative space, because I quite like that brighter part here. So what am I going to do? Let's bring the shadows up a little bit more, bring the blacks up a touch more. I'm even going to lighten it a touch more, bring the highlights down a little bit, something like this. Okay, I quite like that grey. Really think it kind of adds to the moodiness of it. I'm not going to worry too much about things like the... Now, what can we do with this? Now, I think I will just remove a couple of items just because I think they're not helping, that little bit over there. And I think you cropped in probably a little bit closer, but just for the sake of it, just so I've got a little bit of options here, I'll just remove these little bits over here. Okay, so this is essentially what we're playing with. What have we got here? Sorry. Gunilla says, I don't know why the sunspot disappeared when I processed it. Well, it would have disappeared because if you lightened it, and basically it would have taken those greys and it would have lightened the greys up to the white. The sun part of it was already as white as it could be. So just the other levels will have come up to it. So you've kind of got to be slightly careful when you're lightening that you don't kind of lose too much with it. If I take the levels here, I can drag the levels up. You can see I get to a point whereby it's essentially whitened out the sky. So, but I'll nudge that a little bit. I'm going to leave that at this. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about, though, is the notion of the crop, because in essence, I think there's 3 different ways we can play with this crop. Now, one of them was this idea of this going cinematic. And if you kind of bring this down here, so what we're really talking about is we're kind of using the thirds bit, so that the middle bit, the reeds, the platform, the bench and what have you, all kind of sitting in the middle part. We've got the sky with the trees jutting up into the top third, and then we've got most of the reflections in the bottom third. And if I take that and just enter that, and then what we have is we have this kind of cinematic crop. And that's an interesting one. So I think that kind of, if you're talking about wanting that notion of most of the action is happening along this particular line in the middle, and then we're using the fact that there's sky above, but not too much of it, and then we're making a little bit of a feature of the reflections beneath. Now, another thing we could do with this, let's go back here, is to actually, if you had tilted your camera down, okay, so at the moment what we've got is there's slightly more above. I mean, if I was to take, where are we? Where's the middle line? Yeah, that's the middle line. Okay, so that's halfway through the photo. And what we can see is mostly is sky above and all the action as such, all the details happening below the line. What if you'd either squatted down or tilted the camera down slightly so that we had less of the sky, same kind of proportions, but more of the reflections? So let me just get rid of that for a moment. And what I mean by that, I will just use, no, hold on. I'll go here, right. And I'm going to, okay, flatten that. You're going to, yeah, content aware fill. I'm not going to use generative fill. I'm just going to use content aware fill. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this picture and I'm going to move it up to here. So now what we're doing is we're going to just have that smaller amount of sky, a bit like we did in the cinematic crop, but I want to extend out what will hopefully, it will add in a bit more water and reeds. There we go, got something like this. And I think there's something really quite interesting in this. Now, at the moment, the way this is rendered, it doesn't look particularly great. We can see it's fully, just copied, repeated patterns. It doesn't really matter. What we're trying to do here is get the general idea, the general gist of it. And there's something about this. When you've got this part here, now actually in the upper third, and is the textures that are running through on the reflected lake, I think are quite interesting. So that's another way of doing it. Okay, so you can go for that kind of cinematic crop, that panoramic crop, or you can take your kind of original normal crop, your 2x3 or whatever, but just tilt it down. I think that makes an interesting crop. Now, there is another crop that I want to show you. So let's go back to here. And this is about actually upping the negative space. And it's not an immediately intuitive idea, but I want to show you something. What happens if we take this and we extend it up? So let's just make this into a kind of a square. Where are we? So it's width 6,000. It's okay. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take this, and we are literally adding a third or half as much again onto the top. I want you to look at that for a moment. And this is a really interesting one. This one, I think, is now giving it a very painterly quality. There are various, trying to think, I mean, certainly I know there's some Dutch landscapes and what have you. There are certain styles of painting, landscape painting, where you end up with huge skies. Now, very often those huge skies are full of interesting floaty clouds in a blue sky. But where you have the landscape, the whole of the landscape is pretty much literally in the lower third, the bottom third of the picture. And now what we're talking about is taking that notion of negative space. And although it's got the sun in it, we were still because of all that. And we're ramping it up. We're exaggerating, we're intensifying that notion of the negative space. And it really draws the attention down to what's going on, but it changes the mood and the feel of it. Now it feels much more open. Whereas that cinematic crop is zooming in on the space and kind of saying, this is what it's all about. This is creating this huge sense of being out in the elements, that you are out on a sort of slightly sunny, a misty, foggy day. And there's the calm water, but there's a larger sense of the landscape and the way you would breathe it practically. So, different ways of thinking about it. Very often it's said that a lot of the time with our photos, we're either too close or we're too far away. But mostly what we tend to be is in a midpoint where we're not close enough or we're not far away enough. So sometimes what you do is you go, where's the story? Crop in, crop in, crop in until you find the sweet spot. What's the story about? Once you've identified the narrative. Now, if the narrative, for example, was all about this little bench sitting on the pontoon here, then you could crop into this. And this in itself is quite a nice photo. If you just look at this, you know, you can have this hint of the misty town in the background. We've got the chairs here. We've got the little signposts. We've got the reflections. This in itself is quite an interesting photo. So if your narrative is actually about this, then you crop in. If your narrative is about the reeds and the bit of reflection, then maybe we have a sort of slightly more kind of mid-range crop. But if it's about what it felt like to sort of stand on the edge of this sort of huge space, then you come out. And so this is why the notion of understanding your narrative is absolutely crucial in photography. And it's always the one thing that never gets talked about, except on this podcast where it's talked about every single week. But I never hear it talked about. But understand, what is it you're trying to communicate? Are you trying to communicate the reflections? Are you trying to communicate the wood and the seat? Are you trying to communicate the atmosphere and the sense of standing in this sort of big, large open space? And it doesn't really matter. At this point, the key thing is whatever you decide that is the most important part to you. And maybe you want to actually try the different photos. And I would usually recommend in any situation, try zoomed up versions, try pulled out versions, do quite a lot of different versions, because then you will find different stories, different narratives that can be taken out of more or less the same picture. So I hope that helps then, Gunilla. So first of all, negative space, don't get too hung up on the idea of whether something exactly is. It's just a case of the space it's the space around that helps to define the subject. Okay. Now, if the space behind it is busy, like the reeds in your other photo, then that you wouldn't call that negative space because it's too busy. It's attracting the attention. But if it's kind of more or less empty and it helping to define the actual subject, that's kind of what negative space is. And then you can either use it a little bit here and there, or you can really lean into it and go for whereby your negative space can kind of make your subject more into a kind of minimalism side of it. The other thing then is that notion of where do you crop and which of the story elements are you most interested in communicating to the viewer, and then that depends on whether you ramp up that use of negative space or whether you take it out as much as possible to zoom in on the closer in on the subject. Right, so I hope that helps. Right, well, comments we had, so where do we get to? So Marci said a couple of people said happy Easter, and in fact Sandra was eating an Easter egg while she's watching. Did you ring enough for everyone? Alan says the reflection of the seats in the water look a lot like a bird flexing its wings. Well, let's just this bit here. Oh, it does fit. Yeah, I can see what you mean there. Then we've got, so Gunilla that was about the sun disappearing. It says, interesting crop. Susan says, I like this crop very painterly. Oh, Stacey's joined us, apologising for being late. Says, happy Easter to everyone. A roller coaster of weather there. Gunilla says, yes, that's so good with so much sky. My horizons get in the middle mostly. Yeah, the horizons, by and large, you're better off not having the horizon in the middle. Tend to think rule of thirds as your default. You know, either have the horizon in the lower third or at the upper third. You can have them in the middle, like all these things you can, but you've got to have a compelling reason why it should be in the middle. Quite often when it's in the middle, it reduces the energy. Okay. Off center tends to increase the energy of a thing. It reduces the energy when you make things too symmetrical. You can do it, but you've got to have a reason for doing it. And then the further up towards the top and the further down towards the bottom, the more you're kind of stretching that energy and you're changing the emphasis of what's going on. So it's always worth playing around with where the horizon line is. Even if you're, not doing zoom in, zoom out, if you're doing a landscape or as such, just take 2 or 3 shots with the horizon at different levels. Get into a habit of it. And I think you'll start to discover some kind of interesting relationships of sky, horizon, and foreground. Lisa says, helpful explanation. And Gunilla says, thank you. Excellent. Right. Okay. So, what now then? I think about... this is going to go on slightly longer than I intended to. Anyway, we've got about halfway through. So, quick little reminder that if you find these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining even, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can do it. And in fact, actually, if you're interested as well, if you kind of want to do a regular at the Buy Me a Coffee, you can buy me 1 coffee, 3 coffees, 5 coffees, insert however many you want. You can also set up a monthly coffee donation if you wanted as well. No pressure, the option is there. And the other thing, of course, is that if you are sending your images for critique or feedback, to remember that we have the kimayrespodcast@gmail.com is the place to send your images. But also, don't forget, we also have the Facebook group as well, and the Flickr group as well, although that's rarely used. But the Facebook group is another place where you can submit your images and questions as well. That's another point. It doesn't just have to be photos. You can submit particular questions as well. And a quick update on the Smug points situation. So yes, we got through to the end of March, and our March winner was Anton. So Anton won with 90 Smug points accumulated. Gunilla came second with 80, and Viji and Marilyn were joint third with 55 Smug points each. So as we now go into a new month, start accumulating the Smug points for April. But what it means though is because Anton won the Smug points for last week, we've had a little bit of back and forth, and he's come up with a topic for the challenge. So next week I will be talking about the topic, setting a challenge for 3 weeks time. So stick around, don't run off too quickly, and I will tell you all about that at the end. If you do have to run off, you can always come back later and fast forward. Right. Okay. So next up then I'm going to go to Viji. And where are we? So Viji sent in this one, and it's when I first saw this photo, she sent it to me on WhatsApp, and I thought it was a beautiful, stunningly beautiful photo, really, really lovely. When she sent it to me on the problem then came when we kind of looked at it on the larger screen. What we find is, so what we've got here, well, let me tell you what it is. Viji says, this is my niece, Akshaya. Now, I hope I'm saying Akshaya okay. I'm not totally sure on the accent whether it's Akshaya or Akshaya. Close enough. Anyway, forgive me if I'm mangling her name. Anyway, she says, this one I liked a lot. There was a cobweb hanging from a tree, and Akshaya tried to hold on to the twig at the bottom. I framed her face against the cobweb. After taking the photo with my DSLR and transferring it to my mobile while returning, I noticed that her face and her eyes were not in focus. So she was originally thinking about submitting this for the headshot challenge and then realised she couldn't. I was disappointed as I'd already left the resort and I wouldn't be able to have another try. So what we find here is that, so Akshaya is standing behind, and it's a lovely, the light is beautiful. We've got this incredible cobweb here. And then, but Akshaya, as we can see, is out of focus behind. And if we go back to what we were talking about for Ajdin, that when you're doing a portrait, actually having the eyes in focus is a really important part of it. But this is a tricky one. This is a really tricky one because there's also a level of whereby Viji is using a slightly wider aperture in order to make sure that the background is out of focus. Because if we were to use a narrow aperture, go for something like an f11 or whatever, which would have both the cobweb and her eyes in focus, then also much more of the background would come in focus, and that could then kind of interfere somewhat, or at the very least would require quite a bit of tidying up. She goes on. So the next best thing I thought I would try my hand editing using generative AI in Photoshop, and it didn't improve either. No, generative AI isn't, I can't imagine how it would work well in this, other than it would actually change the face and change the whole thing. She says, can you give me a guide if there's a way to use this photograph? Now she also, and when it's a hot day, it's difficult to see what transpires during a photo shot. What are the precautions I should take to avoid such mishaps in the future? So basically 4 questions. Is there a way to improve this shot? How could I edit to make it better? What could I have done to capture both the cobweb and Ayres's face with full justice? And when tethering to a bigger screen is out of the question, how do I make use of the small screen to check that it's okay? And basically, is there a way to salvage this shot? So absolutely, I get this. The big problem, you've taken a photo in the back of the camera, it looks beautiful, you're so happy with it, you get back, you look at it on the big screen and it's failed and you can't go back and retake the photo. Is there a way to rescue it? Sometimes you can. Sometimes you can get in, you can sharpen this bit, you can import a picture from an, if it could be that if you had a similar photo of Ayres and where she was in focus, then perhaps you could kind of, blend the 2 photos together. And sometimes you just can't. Sometimes it's the one that got away. You can tell people about the story of trying to get it, but you weren't able to rescue it. Now, with this, in terms of, could you use it? Maybe if you're using it in one of these online competitions like Guru Shots or Viewbug or something like that, where 99% of people are looking at it on their screen and probably on a mobile phone screen, you can absolutely get away with it. Nobody's going to notice. Okay, at this point, all you're going to do is tidy up. You maybe remove those white chairs in the background, maybe a little bit of vignetting. There's just usual kind of touches to just kind of enhance it a little bit. In terms of, there's not a way to rescue this to get her eyes in focus because they're so out of focus. We also actually do run into a slight problem, which is if her face was in focus, would the cobweb then actually stand out as well, or would the face be conflicting with it? And I don't know is the answer to that one. The fact that her face is slightly out of focus is allowing the cobweb to stand out a little bit more. I think this is one of those things whereby, in a way, it's a learning experience, as in experience is something you gain immediately after you needed it the most, as the old saying goes. And what I would say is, if you get the chance in future, is you take several shots. You take 3, 4, 5, 10 shots or whatever, but adjust your aperture. Try it. So, with a shallow aperture, try it with a narrow aperture, and see what happens, see what works. One of those will work. And it might even be that if you did a succession of photos, if Ayres was able to sort of essentially stay still for 5 to 10 seconds, and you could go click, adjust, if you say got your ISO on auto or the other things on auto, but adjust your aperture. So you go, F11, click F8, click F5.6, click F4, click F3.2, click F2.8, click. All right, click, 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 click. Essentially adjust your aperture or wherever your buttons are on your camera. Then at that point, what you might be able to do is you might find that you've got one where the cobweb's in focus, one where the face and the cobweb is in focus, but you could take one of the shallower ones for overlaying the background so the background doesn't interfere as well. Or you might be able to kind of use layering masks. And kind of that's the only real way that I can think of it. It's a real shame because it is beautiful. I mean, actually, a beautiful young woman, and she's engaged with, in everything you want in a good headshot. She's engaged, her eyes are engaged with the camera. She's got that slight tilt of the head we were talking about. The hair is tumbling down beautifully here. Even the shapes are gorgeous. But like I say, other than in that moment, the other thing when you're saying is, well, how do we know? Is really, you just have, it depends on your camera. Most cameras now, DSLRs, they either have a touch screen in the back, in which case, just like on your phone, you can kind of zoom in, or there's like you'll find a little magnifying glass symbol, which if you keep clicking on it, you can move in. And maybe if you've got a joystick thing on the back, you can move the picture around. And I have to do this sometimes whereby I think it looks fine at this big, but zoom in on the back when you've got a moment and just double check it there. That's really about the only thing I can think of. So I'm afraid I can't solve your problem and actually make this usable at a large scale, but hopefully we've identified some of the problems and ways around them in the future. But thank you for sending that one in, Viji. Where have we got to? So Sandra says, lovely portrait. Ajdin said, nice one, Viji, has an album cover potential. John says, very nice photo. Susan says, I can see your problem, Viji, but it is still a gorgeous image. Anne says, could a stacked image of 2 work? I mean, perfectly possible. It's that little bit of what I was saying is what you have to do is you have to take a few photos at different, really, at different apertures to see which ones are going to work. And Marci says, I like it the way it is, very artsy. I mean, I suppose one other option here is to kind of change the narrative of it, which is if you zoom in more closely. Now, at this point, what happens is it's then trying to find a point of coming in close and deliberately focusing on the maybe on this twig with the spikes and where the web is, and actually going for an even shallower depth of field, zoom right in. So then her face is much more out of focus, still obviously a face, but actually not in focus. So it then becomes, it is about the cobweb and the texture and these little thorns and the leaves. And the face is a supporting role behind it. It's like, oh, somebody happens to be looking at this, but actually the real focus of the photo is the cobweb itself. So that's another way of actually interpreting it as well. So anyway, thanks very much for sending that one in, Viji. I hope that was kind of a bit useful. Right, then finally, we're going to talk about Marci. Then I'll tell you what's coming up, the topic for next week and the challenge for the month. So Marci now has said, I've had problems with editing, specifically masking. So what Marci's done is she sent a photo of smoke. And so what we've got here is we've got the smoke and it's got really interesting texture or what have you. She says, as you can see on the smoke photos, I manipulated the colour. I only manipulated the colours to get the dark background. If you could show us step by step how to properly use masking to get the result I want, that would be great. I've sent the raw file. So let's take a look at the raw file. Now, what we can see from the raw file here is there's a grey background here. Now, if I hit auto, that's no good. It just makes the darks lighter. What Marci's been trying to achieve here is, if we look at the photo, is to have the smoke against a dark background. But we're running into problems here. So what I'm going to do is, let's just open that. And in essence, what we want to have is a dark background, but still keep the light smoke. And that's not very easy when there's not enough contrast, because the real problem is that there's not enough contrast to start with. We can see with our naked eye that some nice light bits. This is very light, but where we get to things like here, it's, the contrast, the difference between this bit and this bit are very, very slight. And so what happens is when we try and darken the background, we end up starting to lose some of the detail. So let me show you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple of different ways you can do this. So what we might do, for example, is we might take the levels. Now, if I take the levels, I can brighten everything up, but that's now blowing the highlights in the light part. So we can kind of ignore that. But if we take the left-hand side and we start darkening it, you see, we can darken down and darken down. And you can now start to see this black coming in here. And it darkens down until we've got, if we go full black like this, now we've got to get, that's about as far as we can go. However, we've now lost some of that smoke detail here. If we bring that black back up, we start to get more grey in the background. Now, maybe we've also got the notion of our middle slider, which can dark, but that's kind of darkening down the mid-tones as well. So actually we end up losing even more detail. We bring that back up, and if we go too high, we're starting to blow some of the highlights here. It's getting very hard. We've lost that ethereal kind of, way of the smoke. So this is, in essence, part of the problem we're up against here is this. Okay, option number 2, something worth playing around with sometimes, is if I duplicate that layer and then I overlay it with itself. And then what that's doing is it's kind of creating a kind of contrast. Now I'm going to duplicate it again with the same kind of overlay, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again. Now we kind of kept more. We've lost some in the highlights. So what we could do is if I hit the mask, turn that to black, and then I would actually have to mask several of them, I think. Let's group those, add the mask, and just try and bring in a little bit more detail into those highlights. So we can selectively kind of bring those highlights in. Let's grab another one of those and push that in, push that in. Yeah, now if I go too many of these, then I'll start to bring in the light background as well. So that's another possible option here. But again, we're still losing detail. It's still not absolutely ideal. Another option, let's go back to, let's open it again, is there's a notion of a layer blending. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to duplicate this layer. Now in between, I'm going to create, okay, let's close that. Let's create another layer. And if we're saying we want a black background, I'm going to create a black background. Then I'm going to stick a copy of the layer on top. Now with this, what I can do is I can go to layer style, is it blending options? And we end up with this little box here. And what we're now looking for is blend if. Okay, there's a little bit down here which says blend if gray. Now, I don't know if there's other versions of this in other than Photoshop, but I do know this one works in Photoshop. And what this does is this affects the action between, the relationship between the two layers. So the underlying layer, that's not really making a lot of difference. I've only got to drop that a bit and we've got the complete black. Now, the thing is really is this. That brings down the blacks. That brings up the lights, which are then getting highlighted. But the thing is here, we can split this bit. And if I hold down the Alt key, the Alt key, and click on that, now what I can do is I can split this. And what you can see is I can bring that down. And that's just bringing the black in, but it's only bringing in the darks. I can take that up, take that down, maybe bring that down, maybe bring that bit back up again. And you can see I can start playing around a little bit with this. And this is giving us a little bit of option here. But again, the main problem is that none of these are really absolutely ideal. And ultimately, your real problem is the fact that it was shot against the background was just too light. There's not enough contrast. And what you really needed to have was to have a dark background against the smoke. Now, John says, I've been told a flash on the smoke works. I'm not completely sure. I would have to see it would depend what the background was like. It would also depend. What becomes slightly more interesting is actually if you've got a flash behind the smoke, not directly behind because it's going to get in the way. If you had the flash to one side and slightly out of shot, and then you had a dark background and you had the smoke. If you had the flash then coming through the smoke, but out of over here, not here but here, then that could make a difference. But essentially we're up against this problem of the fact that the more you darken the background, the more you lose the little subtleties of the smoke. So a combination of levels, brightness, contrast, maybe the blend if options, maybe that kind of overlay thing. These are all things that are going to make little differences. But ultimately, your problem is your source material is because the background is too light to begin with. Now, by contrast, she also said, now, so if we go back, so if we actually look at, so your edit of it, actually isn't too bad for what you've managed to do. And essentially the way you've managed to keep some of the details is by allowing some of still keeping a little bit of the brightness in the background, the kind of grey in the background. You're getting a blue shift as well. But if you tried to have that completely black, you would have lost some of the detail. Marci says, yes, this was shot on a whim when I was trying to do it right with a proper setup. I never get the interesting shapes. It's play. There's a hit rate. You just kind of have to keep going until you get the hit right. But yes, interesting. Now, interestingly also, Marci sent in this photo, which is of a completely different kind of smoke. But we can see here, down here, there's a cigarette and there's a single line of smoke going up to this little tuft at the top here. Now, as a picture in itself, I have to say that I don't know that the cigarette is really contributing. I think you want more of the cigarette if you're really trying to create it. Now, I think Marci's original idea was the idea of having the two pictures kind of contrasting, that you've got this kind of massive smoke and then you've got the little bit of smoke. But what I want to show here is, because Marci also sent in the raw file for this. So if where are we? Okay, yep, click here. What we can see here is that the background is already darker to begin with. Okay, and that allows so much more, so that if I click open with this, we can see that it's not completely dark. So actually what we could do is we can just either take the levels or the brightness contrast. If we take the brightness down a little bit, actually, you know what? I tend to have a soft spot for go for soft light, an overlay or soft light. I think I'm going to go for a soft light. Now, for me, the most interesting, you've got that, and that's kind of interesting. But you know what? I just absolutely adore this bit. There's something about this line and this bit of light and this blueness and that little bit of sort of slightly more, grey brown there, which is gorgeous. Now, zoomed in here, the line doesn't quite feel right. I love the curve, but I want to tilt it slightly. So just this is for me playing around here. What I kind of find myself wanting to do is maybe something like that. And then let's just, I've got it's on content aware fill. Forget that. Let's just put that on background. And then what I'm going to do is this. Okay. And here what we're talking about is just complete abstract, really. We're not worrying about the fact it's smoke. We're not really worrying about the fact that it's attached to, where are we? Is that going to, okay, let's just put a blob up. Okay, what? Deselect. Why am I not getting? Ah, right, okay. Let's just put that on a fresh layer. There we go. So something like this, then. You know what? That does it for me. Just something beautifully minimalist, abstract, line of smoke. Unless you know it's smoke, you're not even really sure what it is. The curve is just beautiful. It's quite sublime. And I think just separating it out, not having to have the reference of the cigarette, something like that. I mean, this becomes practically something that and could you bring it in a bit closer? Yeah, there's different ways you could play with it, maybe. Something like that, maybe even tilted a fraction more. Not totally sure, but I could play with it for a little while, something like that. And I think that is just a beautiful, beautiful photo. So sometimes it's that notion of, well, it's like all of these things, within a photo, sometimes there are different points. Kind of like when we were talking about Gunilla's earlier. There are times when getting in close is going to give you a better photo. There's times when stepping back is going to give you a better photo. In this case, I mean, I know that your original intention, you've got this long, thin picture here, which is kind of about, you've got this little cigarette. Now, and I think that cigarette is cut a bit too close to the bottom. I actually kind of prefer your the bit where the tray is actually in for some reason. But you've got this long thin line and the little swirl, but it's that little swirl. That little swirl is just so beautiful. And so to kind of go in and make a little point of that, I think is, worth playing around with. Anyway, I hope that makes sense, Marci. Basically, when it comes down to it, when you're photographing smoke, you've got to have a dark background. So you start with a dark background. If you are going to be putting light on it, whether it's sunlight, whether it's a flash or anything like that, you can't have that light then also falling on the background, because the background is then going to be too pale, or is going to interfere with it. If you can get the light coming from the side or even behind, as long as the background behind your smoke is black, it should make enough difference. So, hope that all makes sense. Right, comments then. What have we got? So Marci, right. Marci says, lol, I have cropped it that way also. Susan says that smoke is gorgeous, Marci, especially Kim's crop. It appeals to my minimalist brain. Viji says, I missed Kim's critiquing my photo. We'll watch it after the podcast ends. Some emergency, my brother. Oh, well, I hope everything's sorted out. It will be there for when you come back. Marci says, thank you very much, Kim. It's the abstract of the smoke that I love shooting it. Okay, excellent. And Marilyn says, lovely smoke shot. And Stacey says, very good point. And John says a flash from the side makes sense. Yeah. Okay, excellent. Right. So thank you, Marci, for sending that. And in fact, thank you everybody for sending in that images. So to Gunilla, to Ajdin, to Viji, and to Marci. And hopefully then, just to come back to this point, that you can see the benefit of sending in your photos, that having a different pair of eyes, professional, because the big problem we're always up against is we can have a photo and we can quite like it, or we can not be sure. We can put it on social media, and on social media, all our friends will tell us it's lovely, whether it is or not, because A, they're not professional photographers, they don't know what they're looking for, and B, they're being good friends, they're being supportive. Okay, so to them, it's more important that they tell you that you're doing something right than they are for criticizing in a way that they wouldn't know how to criticize anyway. So if you, and the problem is, for a lot of us, is we put our photos up on social media and we get all this positive feedback, but it's not accurate feedback. And so it can sometimes give us a sort of slightly warped sense of how good our photos actually are. But then if we try and show it to a professional person who really knows what they're talking about, what if they sneer at us? What if they're nasty to us? That's not very nice either. So hopefully as you've seen, you can put your pictures in here. I'll do my app. And the kind of feedback I'm giving you is to help you advance your photo. And it's not about blame, and it's not about sneering or anything like that. What we're trying to do here is I've got all this knowledge, all this ability, and so, to see and to work out. So it's here for you. Susan says, oh, Marci, that's my favourite image of the year. I knew I loved it when I saw it on the podcast cover. Brilliant. Excellent. So what have we got coming up then? So now, yes, to come back then, Anton won the March Smug Points accumulation. And so we had a little bit of back and forth with emails and what have you. And what we're going to be talking about is signs, like signs, road signs, shop signs, instruction signs, the idea that there's a sign there with some kind of instruction, whether it's a symbol or it's writing. And so next week, I'm going to be talking about the notion of photographing signs. It's one of these things that you will sometimes, if those of you are on Photo Crowd or Viewbug or Guru Shots or any of these kind of online competitions, you'll periodically will get one of these titles, signs. Now, how do we make that interesting? How do we get, because fine, you can find any sign and you can photograph it, but you can go, yeah, it's a sign. So what? What's the most important bit about creating an interesting photo out of a sign? All the different ways you can do it. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So next week is going to be all about signs, photographing signs. And then I will be setting the challenge for 2 weeks after that, the signs photo challenge. So watch next week, learn what you can, go out and apply it, because this is one thing you can't say, oh, well, there aren't any where I live. I mean, unless you live right out in the middle of the desert, or, you know, in the far reaches of, I don't know, the Canadian outback or something, you know, there's going to be signs kicking about, whether it's, you know, even a road sign pointing you in this direction, or a house sign, or a for sale sign or something. There's always stuff about. So that's going to be fun. And so next week then, signs. The week after, I will have another feedback session. So if you would like to get your photo looked at in depth, if you've got a sticking point, if you're struggling with something, whether it's the photo, whether it's the editing, whether it's the whole concept of it, then send it in. It will get done on a kind of first come, first serve business. So I've got space for up to 4 photos. And then the week after that will be the Signs Photo Challenge. And then we'll be into May, and whoever's accumulated the most Smug points across the course of this month will get to choose the May topic. Right. Okay. I think that pretty much brings us to the end. What's up? Marci said, what have we got here? Marci says, one time I was trekking through the Sahara and came across a no digging sign. Yet you will find signs really in the most bizarre places. It's true. Right. Okay. Thank you once again to everybody who sent in images, and thank you to everybody who's taken the time to comment. Quick little reminder, click the like just before you disappear if you can. It also helps maybe show the podcast to a few people afterwards. And if you haven't done so as well, subscribe, and you know, the usual bits and pieces of, if you fancy buying me a coffee, that's always appreciated too. Right. Okay. Look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care. Bye bye.